Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Delve. Today we're continuing to work on our clone of a Vlambeer game that hasn't even been released yet. Now last time we built the foundation of our project, focusing on player controls and the general behavior for enemies. We also built our first enemy, a green blob that fires what we've deemed hot dogs because of their shape and color. Lovely. And today we continue working on the enemy roster as we focus on implementing the rest of the enemies. Well, at least the ones that we can decipher from IGN's footage of the game that we're trying to clone. We'll do our best to match not only the behavior of the common enemies, but the bigger enemies as well. So let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. The first enemy up was the orange enemy. And yes, we're still referring to these enemies by their dominant colors. Now, the orange enemy is interesting in that, much like the green enemy, their projectile has two phases. First, they spawn a simple orb, which then turns into a homing projectile that explodes once it's close enough to the player. So the first thing we had to do was draw said ball and version of ball with homing missile. And honestly, it ended up looking more like a piece of flint from Minecraft shoved into a ball, but hey, it'll do. I pretty much followed the exact same formula used in the green enemy for the orange enemy. On creation, the orange enemy's projectile acts like a normal projectile would, but once it quote-unquote activates, it not only switches its sprite, but it also switches behavior to start following the player. And there we had it, a rough clone of the orange enemy. Except after looking at my notes, I realized that it's not. The enemy that spawns homing projectiles is actually the yellow enemy. So yeah, there we go, a rough clone of the yellow enemy. But now it was time to create the orange enemy. For realsies this time. The actual orange enemy's attack is pretty simple. It spawns a number of bullets in multiple directions at once, which I tend to refer to as the flower blast. The setup for this is pretty simple. Using a simple loop, I created 8 projectiles, adding an extra 45 degrees to each projectile spawned, which when spawned at once would create that flower effect. Well, it did once I realized I made a typo, which took longer to catch than I care to admit. And thus our actual orange enemy was completed, and we could move on to the next one. And the next enemy is one I'm not 100% sure is accurate, but we're going with it for now anyway. It's kind of hard to confirm what the blue enemy seems to do, but based off of IGN's footage, it seems the blue enemy spawns a random enemy when they die. And this spawn seems to bypass the whole quote-unquote growth stage that usually takes place with the guts. So that's what we're going with. And really, the setup for this can be summed up pretty easily. When the blue enemy dies, choose one of the other enemies to spawn in its place. And so that left us with one last enemy, the purple enemy. From what I can tell, the purple enemy is responsible for majority of the screen shake that made it so damn hard to keep track of what's happening half the time. Yes, it seems that when the purple enemy dies, it explodes, destroying nearby enemies in the process. Now, the simple way to do this would just to destroy nearby enemies, but I thought I'd challenge myself a bit on this one. I decided to create a quote-unquote boom object that spawns a collision circle, which when colliding with other enemies, destroys them. And I mostly did this because I wanted to better understand handling individual collisions via the code and not GameMaker's built-in collision event. So yes, I'm totally aware that I overthought this completely. But still, the end result is pretty similar, with the purple enemy exploding on death and its death circle taking nearby enemies with them. And with that, we've completed the roster of known enemies in Vlambeer's unnamed prototype. Well, we've completed what I was able to decipher from all the chaos at least. And speaking of which, if the example I set up is any indication of what the final game could end up being, I weep dearly for my poor shoot-'em-up skills. But alas, we are not done. We still have the big enemies to get to, after I touched up some of the sprites a bit and gave them some extra definition. But yes, the first big enemy up was Big Orange. Actual Big Orange. And Big Orange is basically regular orange on steroids. So instead of firing a few projectiles at once, it fires a lot more. So basically all I had to do was duplicate the orange enemy, switch the sprite, give it more health, and increase the amount of projectiles from 8 to 15. Boom, Big Orange. Next up was Big Purple. I wasn't able to confirm if Big Purple had similar death effects. Really, the only thing I could confirm was the huge friggin' spirit bomb it seemed to spit out during one of the IGN's clips. So Big Ol' Ball is what I went with. I maybe went a little too big at first. I realized at this point I really should have done some measurements beforehand, but regardless, I toned down the ball and there we had it, a big old spirit bomb for Big Purple. And next was Big Yellow. Now, Big Yellow doesn't behave anything like regular yellow. Instead of a homing shot, Big Yellow fires a huge old laser beam. Now this took some brainstorming, but eventually I settled on a length system. The laser starts at 0 and has a temporary max range of 100. When the laser is activated, the laser variable is increased until it reaches the max number. This is reflected in the way that the laser is drawn, with the endpoint being the laser's position in relation to the max length. And to top it off, I added the little scan the laser does as it grows. I wasn't able to tell if the laser moved in the direction of the player, or if it just chooses a random direction to scan, so for now it just chooses a random direction. And that does it for the entire enemy roster. There is a big blue enemy, however none of the footage seems to actually show what it does, other than tank a lot of damage. And at the time of this recording, no new details have been released, so that's unfortunately all I've got to go on. However, we have made some huge progress thus far, and it's not too far off from the real thing. And next time we get to the hard stuff in figuring out how guts work. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Delve. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Delve in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our progress in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.